Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us on day 2 of the full policy panel, How Washington Shapes Mobile. And again, glad you're here to join us with our panel on catching the millimeter wave and other spectrum waves. I hope everyone has had a chance to take a walk on the show floor. We heard a number of the commissioners commenting on what they saw. You know, I think it's noteworthy, the transition I think that we've seen even just between last year's show and this year's show. Last year, a lot of talk about 5G. We talked about, you know, the increased capacity, the faster speeds, the shorter latency. And this year, it's really translating that into the real-world applications, how 5G will transform and create smart cities, how we're seeing sustainable agriculture, traffic management, autonomous vehicles, really seeing, you know, the applications and those tangible services. So we want to focus on how do we build out 5G? How do we take a look at spectrum that's coming down the pipeline and hopefully to market very soon, and want to hear from our esteemed panel of experts. So let me take a moment and introduce everybody. We have to my immediate left, Tom Straub, who's the president of SIA, the Satellite Industry Association. We have John Hunter, who's the senior director for technology and engineering at T-Mobile USA. We have Jared Carlson, who's VP for government affairs at Ericsson. Dean Brenner, who's Senior VP for Government Affairs at Qualcomm, and then Julius Knapp, he's the Chief of the Office of Engineering and Technology at the FCC. So welcome all. So I want to start with an icebreaker question. So we're talking about catching the millimeter wave. We're talking about the 5G perspective. So in 5G world, what is the innovation that you most want to see invented and come to market? And Tom, I'll start with you. We'll go down the line.
Well, certainly it's interesting starting with a satellite guy to answer that question. And I should note, I appreciate the opportunity to be here. As we went through the various rounds of comments and ex partes in the Spectrum Frontiers proceeding, I kept expecting that I was going to get an email saying, we've retracted that invitation to speak. But I'm glad to be here. I think that in terms of what I would like to see, this is nothing satellite related whatsoever. This is my personal desire as a traveler, just having been through the security process at the airport today. I would love to see the connectivity, advanced analytics, those capabilities used to be able to expedite the travel process. So turn it over to all of those of you who are entrepreneurs and innovators out there to make that happen.
I think you've got some support for that idea. John?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I don't know about catching the millimeter wave. I think the FCC pretty much gave that to us. So I think it's extraordinary record time getting the order out. I echo what the chairman said yesterday. So thank you very much for that. I think first and foremost, I think you think about all the low latency applications and things you want to come to fruition. But to get there, I think for me, it's that three-legged stool that the chairman talked about yesterday, which is, you got the siting issues you're going to have to deal with. I think we've got the backhaul that's going to be paramount when we're talking, the properties of millimeter wave is, really small. So when you take that into context and then you look at the amount of licensed spectrum versus unlicensed spectrum and trying to get that right, I think is going to be critical to seeing the full realization of 5G going forward.
Great. Jared?
All right, and thank you for having me, and thanks to all of you for sitting through the 17th 5G panel discussion. I think maybe this is the last one. So I'll go with one that and I'll hopefully be able to tie it back to something Mark Cuban said this morning, and that is smart city traffic management. So he talked a lot about how where we are now is we have things like Waze, but it's very much of a pull and poke, I think, where there's a term he used. But with smart city traffic management, when you have sensors everywhere, we have real-time analytics all tied together with a 5G network, I hope that traffic will actually be a thing of the past. That will all be, our car will route us. We won't be looking at Waze to see which is the right route. It'll be fine, and the car will be a part of that.
So I always approach these questions with deep humility, right? Because when we were inventing 4G, no one conceived of Uber. No one was thinking of Snapchat. We worked on augmented reality for years. No one was thinking about Pokemon Go. So, the dirty secret here is actually none of us know. So the innovation, what we're really trying to do is produce much, much better broadband wherever you happen to be for everyone. And, that is the goal. And by the way, if we don't achieve that, what are we doing? That's what everyone wants. If you just, wherever I'm with non-DC Spectrum people, and if they say, what are you working on? And I say, 5G. They say, 5G, what's that? And I say, do you want better broadband? I've yet to meet someone who doesn't say yes.
So the hazard of going last. Some of your answers have already been given. But I think it really is important to think about 5G in terms of the things it may do for us, instead of things like, well, what's the capacity and what's the latency and so forth. Because when you talk to your kids or your grandkids and they say, well, what are you working on? They're more interested in, well, what is this going to do for me? And so I drive to work every day, which really I kind of crawl to work every day. And so I use Waze too. And as you look to the future, you can see applications like that helping to reduce traffic, to reduce accidents. And so I don't know exactly how that will unfold. And as coming from a regulatory agency, I know we don't need to know. It will be the creativity of the industry that introduces it. And the other area I would say is in healthcare, is I think we've just, things like the Fitbit and heart monitors and so forth, they're just scratching the surface, because I really think the opportunities that lie ahead for preventative care and care for people who have illnesses or the elderly and so forth, it's going to open up just huge game-changing opportunities in the future.
Great. Well, thank you all. I think you touched on some key elements here, and I think we want to next delve into, right, how does millimeter wave spectrum and other spectrum bands help us to bring these innovative services and technologies to consumers. So there was a mention of 4G leadership in 4G from the United States, a key driver, I think, of the move to 5G. And certainly 4G LTE adoption and deployment has been a hallmark of the U.S. leadership. And we certainly will continue to be providing world-class access to communications technologies using 4G for years to come. But we have July's Spectrum Frontiers order, and again, Julie, thank you and your colleagues for all the hard work in moving that so quickly. Let's talk about how the millimeter wave band spectrum is going to help us meet the 5G challenge, and let's delve even another layer and talk about, are the technical and licensing rules adequate to foster the deployment in these bands while also still protecting incumbent users? And maybe, John, I'll lead off with you.
Yeah, sure. I think first and foremost, when you look at millimeter wave spectrum, it's the amount of bandwidth available that I think really gives you the opportunity, I think, to realize some of the the low latency type applications you're going to see come to fruition. But it's also important to put 5G in the appropriate context, right? I think 5G will be band agnostic. As we heard yesterday, you're going to low, mid, and high band spectrum is all going to be critical. I think when we look in the context of IoT, it's been around for some time when you go back to the machine-to-machine type applications that are there. And so when I think of 5G and like connected car and the smart car and things of that nature, where you really need robust coverage, I kind of scratch my head as to how millimeter wave will support that, right? So you need the physics and properties conducive for the application and service you're trying to provide. So that I think is appropriate to keep in mind. But 5G in general, just as 1G, 2G, 3G, 4G, as we went down through all the Gs, one thing that is consistent and I think we can all appreciate is that it was licensed spectrum that got us there. When I look at and kind of look back, and again, I'm very appreciative of the order that's been laid out and that we have in front of us. So we got 11 gigahertz of spectrum. About 7.6 gigahertz of that spectrum is unlicensed use. Now, I've heard varying debate as to why it's unlicensed, given it's high in the band. But I think it's also important to understand that when you look back at the 28 and the 37, 39 gigahertz band, I mean, it wasn't too long ago, a few years ago, we didn't think that spectrum had any utility for fixed or mobile terrestrial use, but yet here we are, talking about it today. So I think as going forward and looking at high, millimeter wave spectrum, we're going to need more of it, and I think the carriers and operators, they're going to need, the certainty that comes along with that. So I would just urge the commission as we move forward with the further notice and other bands are identified that we put a concerted emphasis on the licensed component of that.
And so what are your thoughts on some of the bands teed up in the further notice? Is it, looking where they can be licensed, in as many, instances as possible? Have you looked, deeply at some of the bands teed up, and do you have specific thoughts?
Yeah, we're going through the further notice now, analyzing a number of the bands that have been, laid out, and not just the bands that have been identified in the further notice. I think there are others that the ITU identified that are very attractive. One that comes to mind, I think if you look at 37 to, all the way to 40 gigahertz, and then in the further notice we go to 42 to 42.5, yet I think there's a sweet spot right there in the middle where you could have contiguous spectrum, recognizing some of the incumbent operations that may be there, but I do think it's an opportunity when you get to contiguous ubiquity of bandwidth. Right there seems to be a sweet spot that hopefully we don't overlook.
Jared, thoughts on both the bands from the order, and then if you have thoughts on the bands teed up in the further
Bands
notice?
to come. Yeah, I think you did a great job of teeing it up, and where this high band spectrum really fits in is giving us these crazy bandwidths, channel bandwidths that we'd never thought about a few years ago. But to get, we have a demo where we're showing 13 gigabit throughput in our 5G modem right here, and we're only doing that because we have these channel sizes that are 200 or 400 megahertz wide. So that's where that fits in. But it is all of these spectrum bands. Some of 5G is going to be very low latency, very high bandwidth, but not all of it is. Some of it's going to be sensors that need to, shoot a signal from underground, for example. But that's how it fits in. The millimeter stuff fits in with the really high bandwidth, really low latency that we need. In terms of going forward, I agree. Licensed spectrum has been sort of the backbone of the revolution that we're going through. But one of the things we're going to talk about when we get around to filing our comments is this concept of a tuning range. And so we're looking at the spectrum bands that the FCC has teed up and looking at what we can manufacture and looking around the world to see what ranges fit in, generally speaking, with what the ITU has proposed and what's going on with other countries. So we're coming at it from this global harmonization point of view, which is trying to find, sweet spots for spectrum that can fit into this particular tuning range. So we can come out with one product that'll support a lot of things worldwide.
Great, thanks. Dean, how does Qualcomm approach the bands?
So fortunately, the way we approach the bands is similar to the way the FCC approaches the bands. I've been talking internally for a long time about 5G being low band, mid band, high band. I've been also talking internally for a couple of years that the timing of, for example, of 600 megahertz is going to line up really well with 5G. And so, I think what's remarkable is not only the huge amount of work in such a short period of time by, Herculean efforts of Julie and the staff, but, wow, in an election year, at an FCC where there is has been a lot of partisan division, a 5-0 vote where if I blindfolded someone and I read the separate statements, you wouldn't be able to tell which one was a Democratic commissioner and which one was a Republican, and that's the way it should be. So I think that is all, tremendous. And so what we're doing at Qualcomm, I like to quote the basketball coach Johnny Wooden from UCLA, hurry up but don't rush. So we got to work feverishly, and we are, on all the pieces of it. And it's interesting because from a spectrum point of view, so for LTE, we have this ginormous challenge that we have 41 plus spectrum bands globally, because of course LTE was in the 5 megahertz chunks, whereas for 5G it looks like we're going to get wider swaths, but of course we aren't going to get perfect global harmonization, and that's okay. That's not the real world, and so our challenge is to deliver solutions that are, have as great economies of scale as possible, either by having a single chip that supports as wide a swath as possible, and having modules that with multiple chips that will support wider bandwidth. So, we couldn't be more excited about it. It's great at the show to hear such a consensus both on the government side and the private sector.
So, Julie, I think it's a huge understatement to say, the commission was faced with a tremendous challenge. A lot of considerations, a lot of balancing to do, whether it's, harmonization and choosing to move forward when the rest of the world, may have said, hold on. We're not done with the proceeding. There's still work to be done. So would love to hear, what thoughts and perspectives you bring to that.
Yeah, I'd be remiss if I didn't start by just recognizing that I'm a small piece, between the chairman and commissioners who all worked hard on this, and the staff across the bureaus. It's really the teamwork that occurred there and with NTIA and Department of Defense. So it takes a team effort to get a project like this done in a relatively short time. So I'll just touch on a couple of things. I think there's been a paradigm shift as we've moved along through the Gs, where we started out thinking Gs were bands. Now, I think where the United States has led the world is in the concept of flexibility, and that any of the spectrum, depending on how the carriers and the service providers see the market driving, where the technology is, they can do with any of those bands as they see fit. There's been so much focus on the millimeter wave spectrum, and it's terrific. It provides huge capacity. It wasn't too long ago that people thought that the spectrum above 6 gigahertz was not useful for mobile, so that's just a huge shift. But we also know that just because of propagation and so forth, what's most likely to happen is that the networks will be woven together with low, mid, and high spectrum as best fit to the need. So the other thing I mentioned is, the discussion about licensed and unlicensed and so forth. I've, because I've been at this for a while, just watched this transformation from the time where we talked about some of it as garbage spectrum, as spectrum that was the tragedy of the commons. I've often told people, if this is a tragedy, we could probably use a few more of them like this one, because we have packed together so much communications in the unlicensed space along with the licensed space, so that hopefully we've been moving past the point where it's either or, but the recognition we need both, and we need to be working hard on both, and that's what we're doing. We've done quite a bit. We've put more spectrum out there in the further NPRM. And then a lot of what you don't really see is the behind-the-scenes work that we do with NTIA, and along with our advisory committees, trying to identify, well, where are the next bands that hold some prospect, not only of whether we can make them available, but whether they will be useful in the overall scheme of things. It doesn't help a lot if we can identify 2 megahertz of spectrum that we could free up if there's nothing that anybody can do with it. So I think we've done a lot. The challenge will continue. We need to keep finding more, and I'm optimistic about what we've done already and where we see things going.
Great, thanks, Julie. Tom, how about from the satellite industry's perspective, and would love to hear your thoughts on what wireless providers should keep in mind as they look to deploy new services in 28 and 37 and 39, as well as your members' perspectives.
I'd like to start by commending the Commission on making an effort to accommodate the interests of all of the parties involved. So it's certainly a challenge, and from most of the satellite operators' perspective, there was a good accommodation that was made. I mean, we're dealing with really flexibility for deployment of new facilities and protection against interference. And I think that there were some reasonable efforts made to accommodate the growth needs of the satellite industry. Some of it remains to be determined. There's a public notice that is to be released that will address some of the calculation issues in terms of population coverage, and I think that assuming that that's addressed reasonably, I think that the satellite industry's needs for flexibility and deployment of new facilities has been addressed. And we're talking about hundreds of locations. We're not talking about tens of thousands of facilities. So from my perspective, this is an eminently solvable issue. I think that one of the other open issues, though, is the aggregate interference of the satellite. And I know many in the wireless industry feel that that's absolutely not a problem. Our members live in fear that when there are millions of devices deployed, it's too late to address that issue. And I think that there's an opportunity for all of us to be able to work on this issue together, because the day after the Commission adopted the order, the White House came out with an announcement. They're funding a 4-city trial of 5G deployment, and it's being handled through the NSF, and I've been in discussion with them. They've already had some discussions with people from the wireless industry about the participation of the satellite industry in addressing these kinds of issues, these potential interference issues. So I think that there's an opportunity to put some real information, hard data into the record that is being opened to deal with aggregate interference. So it's not just a policy discussion, policy debate. But I guess that the comment that I would make to those of you in the wireless industry is those really are the issues of most importance to the satellite industry. The satellite industry continues to grow. There have been announcements of well over 5,000 new satellites to be deployed for broadband services. There are 1,380 satellites in use today, to give you some sense of the planned growth for the industry, much of it in these bands. And so those are the kinds of issues that the industry is going to be seeking to work with you. And it's an interesting situation, because in many instances, we are providing services, certainly for backhaul, more so outside the United States and in the country, but we view ourselves as ultimately being complementary to the services that you're providing. There are some areas of overlap in terms of competitiveness, but again, I don't think that there's a need for us to game the system in terms of the rules that the Commission has adopted. So I think that just realizing that the industry wants some flexibility in terms of location of new facilities, and then ultimately ensuring that there's not going to be interference to those facilities, especially at the satellite.
Great. So thank you. So next, let me try to pick up on a couple of themes that we heard both in Tom's last answer, and then I think the acknowledgement of the importance of kind of low, mid, and high band spectrum as part of building out 5G services. So clearly, I think there's the recognition that those are all going to be essential components. Tom, let's start with you now. Does the satellite industry see itself playing a role in competing for the coverage layer for 5G? The coverage layer generally occupied by the low and mid-band spectrum. I note that some of your members are interested in the 12 gigahertz band, but would love to get your thoughts, and then we'll go down the road.
Yeah, so certainly there are a number of different operators in the industry, and it's interesting how little they share with me in terms of their business plans. But I think that just looking at what has been discussed is, yes, they would like to play a role, recognizing that there are some limits to the coverage capability of millimeter wave services, and that there is going to be a need for ubiquitous coverage. A couple of the examples that were given related to autonomous automobiles. What happens when you get beyond the range of coverage of existing wireless systems or the new 5G systems? So I think that that's an area where there's a potential for the satellite industry playing a complementary role, and I think that they envision that they would be doing that.
Great, thank you. John, thoughts on what else, recognizing the FCC's efforts and those efforts of NTIA and other agencies to look at additional bands of spectrum, what else can the agencies do to look to free up more low and mid-band spectrum, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think we heard yesterday from NTIA, Glenn and Paige in an earlier panel, there's an ongoing effort to support and fulfill the 500 megahertz initiative. One of the bands in particular, I believe that was teed up was the 1.3, what I'd consider low mid-band spectrum, essentially. That is critical. As I said, 5G will be agnostic. It will be predicated on the service and the application you're trying to provide. So that being the case, I do want to address a point, that Tom made. I think just as we recognize the shortcomings of millimeter wave with regard to its propagation characteristics, I think it's also important to understand that is also a benefit with respect to interference management when we're talking terrestrial operations operating, in the clutter. So I think the wireless industry in general wants to work with the satellite industry, and we've done that in a number of cases, and we want that to continue. We certainly appreciate and understand the concerns, but I believe sound engineering practices with both parties coming together to work through the issues, I think we'll learn a lot more from each other.
Great. Jared?
Just in terms of other bands that we would love to see looked at that are not millimeter wave bands, and again, go back to global harmonization, there's a lot that we could do around 3.5 and going a little bit lower, going a little bit higher. Dean, you can tell me how high we're supposed to, is it up to 4.2, or are we looking at 4.2 in another section above that, anything? Because that really holds a lot of promise. It's, globally, this is a band that a lot of other countries are looking at. Europe, in particular, I think is, this is going to be their 5G band, and I'll just echo. I think that as industries, we have worked together. We're happy to do studies, but we think we can get along with aggregate interference. We filed a pretty long document to that effect at the FCC. So,
Dean?
The only thing I would add is, so a couple years ago, if we had this discussion, there was this, intense philosophical debate, and I was just as intense in my participation in that debate. And, we really have moved beyond that. So there's no one who is, religiously opposed to sharing on either the government side or the industry side. It's just working together, figuring out good technical solutions, figuring out the hard work of how to actually make the sharing work. So, I think that that's, a tremendous step forward, and, I think there's all kinds of things that can be done. Now, of course, internationally, so the United States gamely made its effort to try to get global harmonization at the WRC for 28 gigahertz. That didn't happen. And so, other bands which are identified in the further notice are going to be, important bands for the high band part of 5G elsewhere. And the great thing is now they're on the FCC's, in their roadmap as well. And again, it's just a matter of how hard the task is, how high the barriers are to making any of those other bands work. Europe hasn't actually decided yet on its primary high band or initial high band. There's a group that supports 32 gigahertz. There's another group that supports the lower 24 to 27 gigahertz. So, we really are in the United States, because of the Spectrum Frontiers ruling and the further notice, I think, way ahead.
Great. Julie?
Yeah, so the good news is we've got space in play to grow. We know that identifying new spectrum and going through the reallocation process takes a long time. But we've got an auction going on at 600, excuse me, and we've got 3.5 space to grow. We've got all these bands that we just put in place. So then you start, I think the difficulty is we've repurposed a lot of spectrum for mobile through the years, and you start to look at what's left, and each problem seems to be more difficult of a challenge than the last one. So when we look at 1300, and I think people are seriously considering it, it comes down to things like, well, we've got some radar systems in there. We think we might be able to design technology where different radar systems could be combined. We don't know for sure it's going to work. We've got to figure that out first. So you've got those kinds of problems. And for example, at 3.1 and at above 3700, which Tom should have a chance to reply to. You've got some high-powered radar systems in there, and when you start talking about, well, where would they go? You start to move the pieces around and say, well, I have no idea where they would get put. And then, above 3,700 is the C-band satellite downlinks. And you can't just pull the satellite out of the sky and change a couple tuning modules. So, I think people are hard at work trying to find other spectrum that could either be reallocated, but it also points up why there's so much effort going into trying to figure out how we can share spectrum more intelligently in a way that we get value out of it. And I underscore that sharing is not mutually exclusive with an auction. As long as we're getting access in places that people value, the sharing can be beneficial.
So let's pick up on that. What are the elements of a sharing regime that can yield success? So we've touched on 3.5. We're certainly discussing it in spectrum sharing. We're discussing it as we look to new spectrum bands to come down the pike. So, Julie, I'll start with you, and we'll come back down the.
Who brought this up? So I would start with first of all, it's trust. And that happens when you get all of the players in the room that are talking, particularly on a technical level. That to develop a clear set of sharing rules and to have confidence that whatever sharing rules are developed are going to be enforced, that everybody will play by the rules. I think while AWS-3 was largely a reallocation, there's still some systems that are left there. It could not have happened without all of the work of the industry with the federal side and getting all of the technical people together in the room. 3.5 is another case in point. It started out as spectrum that people felt, well, this is not going to be very useful because we can't put towers in there and this kind of systems. And when we got to the idea of small cells and got everybody sitting down at the table and trying to figure out how the sharing would work, we got to a great place there. So, to sum up, trust, clear set of rules, get all the players together, and I think that's really the formula for success.
Dean, what's your perspective? What are the elements?
I totally agree with that, and it's hard to imagine not agreeing with that. I mean, the other thing is, right, there's a continuum of compatibility, and obviously the more compatible the new system is with the old system, the extent to which people are comfortable sharing information. Information sharing has been, absolutely crucial for each one of these efforts. And, the other thing is that there obviously isn't one template, and the ability to adjust to the situation at hand and not to get into the situation sort of mentally locked into, well, we did it this way at this other band, so it has to be the way to do it in this other one. I think that I would add that.
So I guess the only thing to do is add more. So the only thing I'll add, and I confess I heard our CTO say this the other day, so I can at least try to sound halfway intelligent on it, is simplicity. And that, he brought up his fear, particularly in 3.5, that you would, he walked through this whole scenario about adjacent channel interference that I didn't understand. But that was his big plea, was make the rules simple.
Yeah, I think just to compliment, I think I totally agree with everything Julie said, and definitely AWS-3 would not have come to be had it not been for the collaborative effort, I think, between industry and government. It is encouraging, I would say, to yesterday we heard Glenn from CTIA talk about, and Paige as well, about tapping into the part of the spectrum pipeline bill that was making $500 million available for government agencies to go and do R&D projects that would essentially look at other bands not associated with an auction, but potentially could be, and then move that process forward to figure out how that could be done. And so I think that's a great example of public policy in which industry, I know, is a big part of in supporting that. So it's good to see that, particularly in the context, I believe, of 1.3, that we're seeing the FAA and the DHS and DoD taking part in that. And so it is trust, it is collaboration, but it's also funding and things that are available, and we're glad to have been a part of making that come to fruition.
Tom, what about from the satellite industry's perspective?
And so let me amplify a point that everybody else has raised, and that is trust. It's interesting, for those of you who don't know my background, most of my career has been in the wireless industry, and so I know the carriers have dealt with interference issues amongst themselves, and they've established a level of trust. The same thing's happened in the satellite industry. There's interference that's caused from one satellite to the next or from an Earth station, and they deal with it internally. But when we got the two industries together, it was interesting because it's, okay, I know that we can handle this in discussions amongst ourselves, but I'm not sure I can really trust the other person to work with me fairly. So that's just, it's something that will take time. I think that an enforcement mechanism is very important. It's, okay, what happens if there is interference? Is there going to be a means of resolution and quick resolution? And one that hasn't been touched is I think that there is a role for technology. Having most recently run, before joining SIA, a company called Shared Spectrum Company, we had been funded by DARPA to develop sensing-based spectrum sharing technology. And there's another program that DARPA is funding to basically take machine-based learning with spectrum sensing techniques. And unfortunately, they're looking at what the world is going to look like in 2030. So this is not something that we're going to necessarily be able to take advantage of. But I think that looking down the road, there is going to be an opportunity to employ some technology to help address these kinds of issues.
Great, thank you. So let's shift a little bit. We touched on earlier licensed spectrum. There certainly has been a lot of discussion and focus on unlicensed spectrum. So the unlicensed spectrum bands foster a different kind of sharing. And at its core, unlicensed spectrum is meant to open the door to new innovations that share spectrum with existing services. So we heard on the last panel with Meredith Atwell-Baker and the commissioners some discussion about LTE and unlicensed bands. So maybe for the wireless industry folks in the middle, I'd like to hear from you first. What's your take on the process that's been playing out with regard to LTE in the unlicensed bands? And John?
Well, obviously, we would like to see this come to completion and move that process forward. I think we're eager to see technology, innovation. That's one of the I think the pillars of 5G that we're going to see on how you can leverage unlicensed spectrum. And quite frankly, that 7 gigahertz of unlicensed up at the top may not be bad for LTE there, Julie. So I think it would be good just to, move that process along. Part 15, permissionless innovation, is really the hallmark of unlicensed. And I think it's been proven LTE to share fairly in that context. And so just getting beyond, I think, the debate of where we've been kind of in an analysis paralysis mode, getting that, to a point where we can conclude would be much helpful.
Dean?
Yeah, so this actually gets to one other piece of the spectrum sharing template here that I wanted to add, which is incentives. So, Qualcomm, we have a gigantic Wi-Fi business. You can't find we sell 800, 900 million chips in a year, but every one of those has Wi-Fi in them. So as I've said from the beginning, with LTE unlicensed, we would have to have really lost our senses to design something for unlicensed spectrum that would interfere with Wi-Fi. We would be sabotaging every device in the world that has a Qualcomm chip inside. So, we have a very, very strong incentive to ensure that all of the LTE unlicensed technologies share spectrum very, very well with Wi-Fi. We're deeply committed to that. We have been from the very beginning, have had our prototypes in the Wi-Fi Alliance lab multiple times, participated in their Plug Fest. We're doing everything we can to work together to address issues, ease concerns, and work together. And we're doing that because we have a strong incentive to do that. And the same is true for everyone in the wireless industry on the cellular side, because by the way, we're on the board of the Wi-Fi Alliance. Ericsson, T-Mobile, Verizon, Nokia, LG, Samsung, all of us not only have a Wi-Fi business, we're in the Wi-Fi Alliance. You can't find a phone in the Verizon store that doesn't have Wi-Fi, and if you could find that phone, it wouldn't sell. So, and by the way, one good part of the story that kind of hasn't gotten a lot of attention is, so Wi-Fi is evolving as well, like any technology. And because of the innovations in the various LTE unlicensed technologies, a lot of that is being brought into Wi-Fi in 802.11ax, its next generation. And by the way, who's one of the biggest contributors to 802.11ax? Qualcomm. So, Wi-Fi has a long, bright future. The LTE unlicensed technologies have a bright, long future. And, using these technologies for 5G is going to be absolutely essential.
Jared?
So going back to the process, I think I can sum it up for us. We've been frustrated, and it's sad really because, like everything that Dean just said, we would be crazy to do something that would break Wi-Fi. But as a result of this process, it's dragged on and on and on, first from January and then to May, and now hopefully September, we'll finally get some, bring this to closure, is that we've spent 9 months and we don't have any LTU products in the hands of our customers. And we were ready to go. I mean, we were the first to file an LTU equipment authorization in 2015, I think it was. It was last year. And, it's still sitting on the shelf, unfortunately. And, I'll go back to what Chairman Wheeler said yesterday, his keynote, about, the fact that we don't say that it's a 2G band or a 3G band or a 4G band. We just set the rules and you should be able to play with it. We agree. And that, I don't know, of all bands that maxim ought to apply to, it's the unlicensed spectrum bands.
So, Julie.
I was going to give this to Tom.
What is OET's timeline, and can we expect action?
First of all, the reason that the unlicensed space has worked so well has been the collaboration among the players. It is not a prerequisite to comply with a particular standard, but this is not the first dispute that's occurred in unlicensed spectrum among the stakeholders. We had one several years ago that wound up on the Commission's doorstep with an argument about a new standard called Home RF, where the unlicensed community was debating it. And I think what we've been trying to do is encourage the industry to work this out. There's been a lot of progress that has happened over this time. I would say, without slighting anybody, it's pretty rare that folks say a standards process is moving quickly. They usually involve quite a bit of debate and thought, and so there's a milestone coming up. On September 20th, there's a workshop slated to consider a coexistence standard. It's our hope that the players come to an agreement on a way to determine what coexistence, living together, that everything can play nicely with each other, happens after that. And, after that time, there'll be a little bit of period for the standard to be published. We'll see where we are and decide what, if anything, the agency needs to do then.
Great. Thanks, Julie. I'll give you an opportunity if you do want to comment.
It's nice to not have a dog in that fight, sir.
Okay. All right. It's time to break out our crystal balls, and it's a particularly dangerous, forecast time in an election year. But for 2007, before we close, let's take a look at 2017. What will be the FCC's biggest goals? What should be the FCC's biggest goals? And where will each of your organizations focus your attention? Tom?
Well, certainly, I think we're going to be focused on the spectrum issues. I'll call it the ongoing issues from Spectrum Frontiers. We've got the public notice that will be coming out, the further notice. So I think that those will continue to be big issues. One other one that I know that the FCC is starting to look at is issues relating to the sheer number of satellites and small satellites and the role that they should play. Given the numbers that I've talked about, it's an issue that everybody's starting to recognize that space traffic management is an issue. There's a role that the FCC is involved in, and they're identifying. I know there's plans for a notice of proposed rulemaking as it relates to some of those issues. So I encourage them to move forward with that quickly.
Great, thanks. John?
So crystal ball, I think I would have to look at this, as we move forward with the further notice. And I agree with, with what Julie said. There has to be a balance, with unlicensed and licensed spectrum. And we go into this debate, and now I think we see, in the current RNO, a disproportionate amount of that spectrum going to be for unlicensed. I think when you even peel back the onion a little bit on what's actually going to be teed up as licensed spectrum, the actual percentage of that spectrum that will come to auction is a fraction of that when you take out the incumbents that are already there. So I think from a crystal ball perspective, I would look at this and say, as we move forward with the further notice, that we kind of right size the licensed versus unlicensed, and bring more of that spectrum to the fore.
Great, thanks.
All right. Well, I hope that in 2017 the conversations that we're having are more operational disputes, that we're to the point where we're going to deploy this stuff, and that we're picking around the edges and making sure that everything's right because we're ready to go. The sooner we can bring our products to market, the better for everybody.
Dean?
So I'll just follow the low band, mid band, high band. Expecting a very successful 600 megahertz auction, and as soon as it ends, we'll work like beavers to get the spectrum put to use. I think the 3.5 with both finishing up the Win Forum standardization and the SAS certification process that's already underway, that'll just move right ahead. And separately, we're already doing the technical work on the chip side. And then I think in the high bands, we will see 5G trials in the United States in 2017. And we'll be working with everyone in the industry to move 5G into commercial operation as quickly as possible, thanks to the Spectrum Frontiers ruling.
So it never gets quiet at the agency. If you think that happens, it's a myth. I know in my shop there's maybe 50, 60 projects going at the same time. The things that I see, there'll be a lot of focus on the auction at 600 happening, but then the real work starts of making it all happen. And I'm quite confident it will, but there's a lot of work that will have to happen there. Yes, we've put the rules in place at 3.5. Now we've got to get the spectrum access systems up and running and actually get systems operating. We're just as eager as everybody else. We still have a lot of work going on in unlicensed at 5 gigahertz in this middle segment at 5350. We've got the potential for unlicensed sharing with the transportation spectrum at 5.9. We still have a long ways to go, I think, with more things we put on the table in the millimeter wave proceeding. So there's always plenty of work ahead, and I think that's good news because the idea here is to make more spectrum available, but keep at it for the future.
So key themes, there's more spectrum to come down the marketplace, come to market, but we've got a lot of work to do, and then once it comes to market, we've got to build it out. So a lot of challenges lay ahead. We look forward to working with all of you going forward. Thank you to our audience for joining us this afternoon. Please stay for the next panel, but before we break, please join me in thanking our panelists.